Welcome to the Derek Diamond Experience podcast, where every week I take a look inside the world of film and television with those who have lived it and experienced it. I am your host, Derek Diamond, and for today's show, I'm really excited about this discussion because we are talking screenwriting, everything from getting your story started to rewrites, getting feedback, and what to do with your script when it's done. And I thought there'd be no better guest than a returning guest, the writer, director, and producer of the short film Sur'vi, as well as writer of half a dozen short films, Mr. Steve Wise. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm fine. Thanks for having me back, Derek. And by the way, I can think of a lot more people that might be better guests than I am, but I appreciate you saying that.
No, it's all good. I think this is actually the first time you've been back since our epic Star Wars marathon that we did last year.
Yeah, which that was a blast.
Well, yeah, anytime you talk Star Wars, it's a fun time. I think we spent like nearly 4 hours recording, and I had to split it into 3 different episodes. So that was a fun little venture. But I wanted to have you on the show today to discuss screenwriting, because screenwriting is, all films start with an idea, whether it's, something you randomly think of driving in the car or discussion that you have with friends. You're like, oh, that would make for a great short feature, whatever the case may be. But putting it to paper is a bit more difficult than people might expect. So talk to me about, when did you fall in love with the screenwriting aspect of the process, and kind of go into, how to get your script started?
Well, just to give you a little history, I have been making short films, I guess, with my friends since I was 8 years old, and I actually wrote my first screenplay, if you will, I was about 11, I think, 11 or 12. And I tried my hand at a couple of them. I was doing some playwriting also at that age. And but I actually wrote my first feature-length screenplay when I was 15.
That's something I still have yet to do. So the fact that I'm talking to somebody who's done it at 15, that's pretty awesome. So what was the script about?
It was an adventure story.
Okay.
Teenagers.
So did you know from an early age, like the proper formatting, story structure, things like that?
I really had no idea about. I was just kind of, of course, at that age, you're learning and you're just kind of experimenting, and I didn't have a whole lot of access to materials, other screenplays. So I was just kind of winging it and doing because I'd read a lot of plays, and so I was kind of using that as a guideline. Couple screenplays that I actually did read when I was young. When I was in 6th grade, the TV show The Waltons actually had a very special episode where one of the girls, her husband, had gone away to in the army, and the character was at Pearl Harbor during the attack and ended up getting killed. And so the whole episode revolved around the notification that she received that her husband had died during the Pearl Harbor attack, and they actually printed the screenplay, or the teleplay, in the newspaper, and so I was able to get a copy of that earlier that day, and we actually read it in class, and then maybe a day or two earlier, and so when they had the actual episode aired, I was sitting there in front of the television reading the script along with it. And so that was my first real introduction to, even though it wasn't in proper format, it's still, because they kind of rewrote it for the general public. But it still gave me an insight into how a screenplay was written for, or a script was written for the screen. And then another resource I had as a teenager was in the early mid 80s, there was a magazine that was actually the Twilight Zone magazine, and each issue had a teleplay by Rod Serling, so from one of the original episodes. And so I had a whole collection of those. I still have those magazines somewhere in a box. But reading through those, that was another insight into, oh, okay, this is how it's, you know, you write something that's for the screen, that's intended for actors to read and for the director to take. A little different writing style than what we have today, but it's still, that was kind of what I was using as a basis.
Yeah, and it's interesting because now that I've written a script and I've read a couple that I know you've sent me. You've sent me a couple. I found others online. It's interesting going back and watching the actual film after reading the script, because I feel like you get like a whole different type of appreciation for the process.
Right. Yeah, I've read a lot of screenplays of movies that I've liked, and in fact, I've got somewhere in one of my bookcases, I've got the some of the Star Wars movies, some of the Star Trek films. They released like the screenplay in a bound published edition, which was kind of nice. And it is kind of interesting reading the script from a movie that you are familiar with, because you notice lines that are different, and just the way that it's described, you know how it ended up playing out on the screen. If you read the script ahead of time, which I've done actually for a couple of Batman movies, Batman Returns and Batman Begins specifically, I read both of those scripts before the movies came out. And so going into the film, I already had knowledge of how they were written. In the case of Batman Returns, the version I read was one before, I believe it was Wesley Strick got a hold of it, or was given it, and his job was to cut it down because it was just too unwieldy for them to film, and they ended up postponing production by a few weeks to allow him to just chop scenes, and he ended up not wanting his name on the movie because he just basically just butchered the script just to make it shorter.
Yeah.
And it shows in the final product, even though it's my favorite Batman film, the story is very disjointed, and it's because they just chop scenes. And going into the film, it's like I had this expectation. It's like, wait a minute, this is different.
Yeah, that's interesting, because now I'm thinking back to that movie, and it's been a while since I've watched it, but yeah, I can see where it would be a little disjointed in some places. But kind of moving on to more aspects of the screenwriting process. So you went to film school at University of Central Florida. What were some of the biggest lessons that you learned about the screenwriting process while you were at UCF?
Primarily, just the formatting, and having had the opportunity to get feedback from the professor, the instructor, or instructors, I should say, because I took several screenwriting classes, and other students who read, give feedback. It was a little bit of an eye opener because, like I said, I've been kind of navigating myself, just without really knowing fully how to go about structuring and formatting. I kind of had an instinct for it, but until you're actually given direct instruction that this is the proper way to go about doing it, you're just kind of left guessing. And so one of the biggest lessons, I guess, was what the industry expects, and because you have to talk the same language, and if people in the industry read something that's amateurish, or that is not what they're used to, they flag it immediately as not professional, and it's an excuse to discard it, because they're always looking for reasons to say no.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because that was actually going to be my next question: is why is the structure and formatting so important?
Well,
But no, that answers that. So, talk to me a little bit, because as I mentioned, you've written half a dozen short films. If someone comes to you and says, how do I get started with my script, what would be the first thing that you tell them?
As far as like if they wanted to do a short film themselves.
Correct.
Okay. Um, the, the biggest thing is coming up with the good concept and a solid concept, because if you're doing something on a short, I mean, every screenplay is different, and you have to figure out what your market is and what you're planning on doing with the screenplay. So, for instance, if you're doing a feature length screenplay, what is your intent for that? Obviously, it would be difficult for the average person to shoot it themselves. So you're either going to put it into a contest or a film festival, or try to sell it, or just have it as something that like, yeah, I did this, cool. So if you're doing it for yourself, that's one thing. But if you're doing it for other people, it's a situation. For a short film, most people who are writing short films, they're doing it because they intend to direct it or produce it themselves. And so the biggest challenge is narrowing the scope down to where it's something that could be feasibly shot on the budget that they're working with. So, for instance, you need to look at locations and the number of characters, and in the length and other production value, if you will, that what can you do to make it cinematic, but at the same time, how do you keep it within a range that is reasonable for what you are able to achieve? So that would be my first advice as far as conceptualizing it and just kind of figuring out what exactly you want to do with this.
Well, I can speak from past experience. You write your script, and we'll get into rewrites here in a second, but there's so much more that goes into it. And speaking from experience, when we did the Parker Syndrome a couple of years ago, there was a lot that I didn't know about it as far as judging location, what's going to be feasible to do. Because I remember in the original draft, I had several more characters, and one of the pieces of advice that you gave me was, is this character necessary to the story? Because with a short, you only have a certain amount of time to tell your story. With a feature, you can get away with it more, but with a short, it's, you kind of get to the point, and every scene has to drive the story.
Well, and realistically, that same advice applies to features also, because you think, oh, well, I've got 2 hours to tell the story. I've got all the time in the world. But then when you start, actually putting it together, unless your story is very thin, in which case then you need to kind of go back to the drawing board and see, where the story is faltering. But, if you have a 2-hour story, every scene counts, because, kind of like with Batman Returns, here's this big blockbuster major motion picture, and they realized 2 weeks before they were starting to film that it was just too big for them. It was just too much for them to shoot. So they had to go in and just cut scenes and try to sew all the pieces together to make it cohesive, which whether or not they were successful is debatable. But but for a short film, yeah, like I said, you're dealing with whatever resources you have. If you happen to own a camera and you're able to shoot it yourself, great. But more times than not, the person writing the script who's intending to direct it, you're having to rely on other people. You're having to rely on another crew, or crew to bring in, and you're relying on actors who are giving up their time to be in a project that hopefully they think is kind of cool. And you want to give everybody something, reason to work on this, other than just, well, I'm helping my friend. What is it about this story that is enough to make people excited about working on it? Because if you can get people excited about working on it, you're going to have people excited about watching it. And ultimately, that's the goal for anything, no matter what size or scope it is for the audience to enjoy it and to get something out of it.
Yeah, and I say this almost ad nauseum with shows that I do and various interviews and whatnot, my favorite aspect of the filmmaking process, and I got it with the Parker Syndrome, and I also got it, with working on Sur'vi, was the collaboration. Because I use this analogy a lot. A film is a giant machine, and everyone from the director, writer, DP, all the way down to the PAs are all cogs in that machine, and they all have to work together in order for the machine to run. And it's a really rewarding process, in my opinion.
It can be very rewarding. It can be very frustrating. It can be a
That
lot
too.
of different emotions. But it all starts with the story. I mean, there's things that you're going to be running into production problems every step of the way, probably. Actors who can't say a line, so you have to try to figure out how best to rewrite the line to where, because it can't get out of their mouth, and I've run into that myself, where it's like I can't wrap my mouth around these words, and so you, as the writer, you have to figure out, okay, what's the intent behind this line, and can I rewrite it? You're going to run into location problems. You're going to run into weather problems. You're going to run into technical aspects of things where, you didn't anticipate equipment malfunctions, and so now suddenly we're short on time, and we have to, quickly wrap up what we're doing to make it we can actually have a movie. A lot of that doesn't have anything to do with the writer per se, but you as the writer, you want to kind of think about things when you're going into it. Like I was saying, if you are planning on directing it, what potential problems are you going to be running into because you've written yourself into a corner? Let's face it. And this is a story I tell all the time regarding Sur'vi, is I wanted to do a movie where two people were sitting in a room talking, and just because I wanted it simple, I wanted it, to where I could just work with the actors, not worry too much about the camera, just and technique. I just wanted good performances. And as I started writing this thing, it ended up being 5 actors, including a child, in the woods, all exteriors, with special effects and fight scenes. So I wrote myself into a situation to where I had a lot of production problems. I mean, and so I knew, because of having had a certain amount of experience, that I was going to have to rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. The fight scenes in particular were going to have to be well choreographed ahead of time. And fortunately, Deso Faulkner came in and was able to handle, choreographing those fights. And, I had special effects and makeup effects that I had to worry about. And, we brought in a drone. And, so these were all things that were above and beyond my role as a writer. But that role as a writer was the reason why my role as a producer and as a director then became more complicated. But it served the story. And if it didn't serve the story, because there were things that, and I'm going to give a shout out to Chris Kubiak, because I was kind of bouncing ideas off of him early on. And he's like, well, we can have a caravan of people. No, Chris, we can't. So, I can't afford to bring in a cart and horses and costume up a bunch of extras for, no, it's just not going to happen. So, I had to kind of think about, well, what's the best way of doing this? And even though we ended up with 5 characters, each, which is kind of, large cast for a movie like this, but each character served a purpose and had to be there for a reason. If we lost one, then the story would change, and then I would have to, kind of rethink what the best way to tell the story would be. So, those are all things that, as a writer going into it, that I had to take into consideration. And location was the biggest issue. And if I didn't find a good location, no matter what the story was, I would be able to tell the story.
I'm just picturing that conversation with you and Chris, and it's hilarious. But that's actually a good segue into what I wanted to talk about next, and that is character development. Because as a writer, characters are they drive the story. They are the most important aspect of the story to me. So, talk about some of the challenges that you've had with character development and how you've worked around them.
Well, one challenge that I have personally is making all the characters sound like me. And to some degree, that is okay if you have a particular character that is my stand-in. um, but in order to bring that character's voice out and make each character unique, and not only within the script, but from one screenplay to another. If you read a collection of my work, I hope there's a common voice that's there, but I hope that the characters don't all sound the same. And so you have to find out what the inner workings of the characters are. What are their motivations? You can take a whole masterclass on writing characters, but it's a very similar thing that actors go through as far as analyzing, what is this person's personality? What are their quirks? What is their speech pattern? What are their desires, their wants, their needs? What are the challenges that they have in front of them? Pixar, they have kind of a list of things of, their rules of storytelling. And one is your protagonist figuring out what they, what they like, what they do, what they're good at, and then giving them the polar opposite, to where they now have to do something that's completely different and out of their realm of their comfort level. And so you have to kind of think about, okay, what are the dynamics between the characters? And specifically, you have to identify who the protagonist is, because if you don't know, and I've seen this, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've seen this. I've judged screenplay contests, and I've read a lot of screenplays in my life from other people, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish who exactly is your main character. And once you identify that person, then what is their character arc? Where do they start, and where are they going to finish? Are they a dynamic character? And how do they grow through the course of the story? A lot of times you don't see that growth. It's just a stagnant character. And also, how do they relate with one another? If you have, let's say your protagonist has 3 supporting characters that they interact with. Well, that person is going to interact with each one of those characters in a different way. So, he might be attracted to someone, or he might really dislike another person, or the third person might be a coworker that he treats on a very professional manner, as opposed to a personal manner. So, you kind of have to take that into consideration also, that, the dialogue that you have, the scenes that you build, are going to be driven by that character and the way that he responds to or she responds to situations, and the choices that the protagonist makes. Because your story is driven by the character.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so once you kind of figure out what that protagonist is, then even though you might have your plot, there's certain things that your plot demands, but your protagonist may make decisions that take you in a different direction, and realize, oh wait, he's not going to go that way, and so where is he going to go? The decisions, and it all comes from internal. That might lead in a completely different, surprising direction than you don't expect.
Kind of like going from 2 people sitting in a room talking to a either pre-civilization or post-apocalyptic type of short.
right?
But I mean that's so. I recently took Aaron Sorkin's masterclass, and
Oh, did you?
the first lesson that he taught was your protagonist has to have two things:
Hmm.
intention and obstacle.
Right.
You have to have what does the character want to do, and what's keeping him from doing it.
Exactly.
So no,
It,
you echo that 100%.
well, conflict is what drives the story.
Yeah,
I remember back in high school, in fact, one of my English teachers talking about how, um, give an example of, there's this young couple and the guy just came back from war and, he gets with his girlfriend and marries her and they settle down and they love each other and they live happily ever after. Okay, that's not a story because there's no conflict. So you have to build that conflict in a screenplay. No matter if you're writing a short or writing a feature, you have to have your overarching conflict. Now, what is that main conflict, which basically comes down to your log line, one sentence that describes your movie. Person
yeah,
A has this goal and has this conflict and has to overcome that conflict. That's the story. You can build in all these other complications around, but what your main conflict is your story. And no matter if it's prose or screenplay format or TV or whatever medium you're working in. But the thing is with screenplays, like I said, you don't have that luxury to just meander. A novel, let's face it, you can, even though experts may advise against it, but I've read a lot of meandering novels in my lifetime, and where you can just kind of take your time and develop and go into the character's backstory and the history of this town and things that don't directly relate to the plot. But in a screenplay, you have to be efficient. Has to every scene has to be a building block to advance the story, and yeah, that conflict has to be present. Every scene has to have conflict, no matter if it's conflict of, oh, I'm out of coffee. I just woke up and I'm tired and I have to get my day started and I can't drink coffee because not that I drink coffee, but your character might drink coffee, and so that's just a conflict that may be just a complete aside, and the actual scene might be about something else that the character is going through his mail and trying to get ready for work or whatever, maybe a mundane situation, but that little bit of conflict there makes the scene interesting. And if you have a dialogue scene between two characters, do both the characters have the same goal, or does one character have a goal that is conflicting with the other character? And even if it's just a matter of, one character doesn't want to talk to the other one, or doesn't want to reveal something, and is trying to keep it a secret, and or just to keep it personal, and the other one just keeps digging, and or there's a personality conflict where one person characters doesn't like the other one, and so you're running into these little conflicts all the time that may or may not have any direct bearing on the overall conflict, but it builds that scene, it builds the drama, builds the just the interest, because people like watching conflict. They like, what's the problem?
yeah.
We want to see the problem and see it resolved.
Well, yeah, and like you mentioned, the little nuances, like the coffee, even though it may not drive the main story, it's still something that I'm sure most of us coffee drinkers could probably relate to at some point. So it's like, little nuances connect with different people in different ways. So I like little things like that. Also, shout out to Nick Smith, who's watching on Facebook Live. He says, "No coffee," with exclamation points afterwards.
Hey, Nick, how you doing?
So you mentioned dialogue, and I know that's something that I personally struggle with, is writing good dialogue, because for me personally, I'll write something and I'm like, there's no way that people would actually talk like this. So what are some of the challenges that that you've had with dialogue or that others might have with dialogue, and how would you recommend dealing with them?
Well, one bit of advice that I've heard in the past is, well, can't really do it in today's climate right at the moment, but go to the mall or go to a restaurant or go somewhere where there's people and listen to people. Just stay in the background. Maybe bring a recorder. Don't share it with anybody. It's just for your own personal reference and research. But listen to speech patterns. Listen to dialect. Listen to how people relate to each other, because we talk in a shorthand, and I try to say complete sentences when I talk. Don't always succeed in that. A lot of times I feel like I'm either rambling or just I'm not communicating very well to people when I speak. And you might have a character like that, who just gets tongue tied and doesn't know how to respond to people. So, think about your own, where you're coming from and your own experiences, but also look at people around you and see the way that they talk. But here's the one problem that a lot of writers, and I've been accused of doing the same thing, is surface dialogue and not writing subtext. Subtext is like the hardest thing about screenwriting, because you want to explicitly say things. This character is upset, so he's going to say, "I'm mad." Well, chances are human beings aren't going to say that necessarily. You might say everything around it. No, I'm fine. What's the tone of voice? What's the body language? What's the actions? So if you pair up an action that the character is doing with the dialogue, the action can be direct opposite of what the dialogue is saying. And if it's like, oh no, I really enjoy this movie, and the character's sitting there, with his arms crossed and just scowling when he says it, because his girlfriend is making him watch this, romantic comedy that he doesn't want to watch. So no, it's fine. I like this movie. Well, no, he doesn't. The subtext is there that he's not telling the truth. If you have given the audience a piece of information earlier, and now the character is, and we know that the character has that bit of information, but is not expressly stating it, but kind of dancing around the issue and trying to avoid it, we understand where that character is coming from with that. So, that's a whole masterclass right there in writing subtext. The more you can get the subtext down, the better, the stronger your story will be in your screenplay.
Yeah, and that was one of the bigger lessons that I took from that same masterclass. And I also think it's the more you write, the better you'll get at it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's just like anything. It's a muscle that you have to flex. And, the more that you do something, the better you'll get, in theory, unless you just keep making the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah.
Put it in other people's hands. When you have something written, it's really hard to be objective to it, because what your intent is. Did it come across that way? So give it to people who will be objective. Don't give it to your mom, because your mom's not going to be objective. She's going to say, "Oh, it's wonderful." And
it's the best thing I've ever read.
Mom. I needed that little pick me up, but you're not telling the truth. So, but sometimes getting that feedback and getting objective criticism can be hard. It's and the initial inclination is to fight back, because someone dared critique you, and you take that as like, okay, they're attacking you personally, when no, you're not. They're just pointing out flaws that they perceive. It may not be accurate. That's their perception or their opinion. which is why I generally give something, when I finish a script, I give it to several people to read. Because if they all come back with the same notes, then it's something that I need to address. If it's negative, I need to address it. If they all come back saying, "Oh, this particular element worked really well," okay, cool, I'm onto something. But if they're just like, yeah, that ending just, or some of the dialogue was kind of cheesy. Like, okay, yeah, I can write cheesy dialogue, so yeah, go back and address that.
Well, and that's something that's important too, is to have that. I don't know if inner circle would be the right way to describe it, but have those select people that will give good objective feedback, because that's really the only way that you're going to learn. Because, if I give you a script, you're not going to have the same attachment to it that I do. So you're going to see things that I don't. Same thing with, if I'm editing a video and I send it to you and you notice things that I don't. It's good to have that outside perspective. Now, I wouldn't go around giving it to everybody, but I would have, like I have 3 to 4 people that I send my work to get their feedback on. So I think having that inner circle is really important, and it keeps you honest, in my opinion.
Well, times that I've given feedback to people, I get to the nitty gritty of things, and I'm not going to gloss over anything, because my intent is to help the person, improve and have the best possible screenplay that they can write. But I can nitpick a lot of stuff, and sometimes people don't appreciate that. So it's like, hey, you asked. I'm giving you my opinion from a screenwriting perspective. But you also have to take into consideration who. Excuse me. Sorry about that. But you have to take into consideration who the reader is. Are they a screenwriting expert? Or are they a writer in their, themselves? Are they an audience member? Are they someone who are a fan of the genre that you're writing? Will they understand what you're trying to get across? My first screenwriting teacher actually told the class, never write science fiction or fantasy. Just don't. Because his thing was, write what you know and write real life. And fantasy and science fiction is not real life. You're using your imagination and you're writing something that's beyond your scope of knowledge. I didn't really like that instruction, because that's kind of what I write. And so every assignment that I had in that semester, I wrote something that was science fiction or fantasy and got a straight B in the class. So he refused to give me an A or anything. Maybe I didn't deserve it. I don't know. But the thing is that, sometimes, like, my friend Lee Shapiro, that I wrote several screenplays with, he and I had a comedy called Sinkhole that was a satire of disaster films. And
I love this story, by the way.
Thanks. I mean, it amused us. Let me put it this way. It still makes me laugh when every now and then I'll dig it out and read it. Just certain lines of dialogue or certain situations just strike my funny bone. But not everybody found humor in it. And I was participating in Francis Ford Coppola's company, Zoetrope, has a website, and it's still active as far as I know. But for the longest time, I was participating in their screenwriting group. So you could log in and have people read and give feedback to your script, but you had to read and critique 4 screenplays to get the feedback from one of yours. And so I read a lot of scripts out there, and actually made some friends through that forum also. But someone read Sinkhole and got onto there was a message board that was there, and apparently didn't understand that it was a comedy. And the header for the post that she made was Stinkhole. and just went on talking about how we were trolling the website because she just couldn't imagine that anybody would have written this and taken it, as a serious screenplay. Well, it wasn't a serious screenplay. It was a comedy. It was a satire. It was kind of like Blazing Saddles or, Young Frankenstein, in that vein of, it's something where the characters had to take it seriously, but the situation was completely ludicrous.
Yeah.
And scene after scene had just ludicrous, events that happened, but the characters were treating it like this was, real life or death situation. And so I read that and I was just like, oh, gee, okay. And, she honestly thought that someone would sit down and write a feature-length screenplay just to troll the readers. And a bunch of other people who had read the script apparently got on and just lambasted her and said, no, this is if you don't know what you're talking about, this is a comedy. And, so they went on and explained. And after like 20, responses, I finally said, well, as one of the writers of the script, I can assure you that this was a realistic thing. But the capper to the story was, we sent this to Richard Donner's production company, Donner Schuler Donner Productions, and this woman, Mary Lambert, I still remember her name. She read it and sent us a very nice letter in the mail that said, this screenplay has absolutely no humor in it. Yeah. So, whereas other companies that read it, they said that they loved it. They thought it was hysterical. It was just too big budget for a comedy. It was a disaster film, so it had to have a lot of special effects. It just didn't want to, at that time, spend a lot of money on a comedy. So it never got made, but I still think it was funny, though. It has absolutely no humor in it. None.
I wonder if she read the same script that the other companies did.
I have a feeling she just either didn't have a sense of humor herself, or her sense of humor was different than what was in the screenplay. And that's the thing. Comedy is subjective, and it's really hard. What I find funny may not amuse other people. And I've certainly watched comedies that have been produced and people really just love them. And I've watched it going, so yeah, it's very subjective. And so know your audience. And when you're asking for feedback, take that into account, that other people may not quite get what you're doing. And so if you have that one outlier that just comes and says, I don't know, I don't get it, where everybody else, you have 10 people read it and that one person just rips it apart or whatever. Well, ask yourself, is it the script or is it that person? Because not everything is for everybody. Now, if 9 of the 10 people come back and say, yeah, this doesn't work, it's not good, maybe you need to go back and rethink.
Yeah. I will say, as a side note before we get to my next question, because you've told me the sinkhole story before, it had what would have been the greatest movie tagline, I think, in cinematic history. This movie
we came
sucks.
up with, yeah, that was my idea, actually. But, Lee might have different memory on that. But remember, we were in the middle of writing From the Ashes, which was a really heavy post-apocalyptic type of story. And as we would be into, this wrestling scene, we would just start making jokes. And at the time, there was all these, it was kind of the height of the disaster film era. And just, said, yeah, they're going to run out of ideas. And next, they're going to make a movie about hail. And I believe I said, or no, they're going to make a movie about a sinkhole. And the tagline is, this movie sucks. And so, yeah, then we came up with, the follow-up, which was Geyser, the musical. And the tagline is, this movie blows. And then we would have animal attacks movie, because we haven't had any of those in a while.
Yeah.
And the tagline would be, "This movie bites." So that'd be our trilogy.
How these have not happened yet, I have zero clue, because I would watch all three in a heartbeat.
Yeah, we never could quite figure out the geysers.
Yeah. Maybe one day. We'll see. So what to you would be some of the biggest things to avoid while writing a screenplay?
Well, one of the biggest is what I call unfilmables. Yeah, I'm sure that there's a technical term out there, but basically, when you're writing something, when you're writing a screenplay, the only thing you can really put on paper is what is seen on the screen and what is heard. So dialogue, action, describe the setting, describe what's going on. You can give a little bit of insight into the character motivation, if you will, but be kind of careful with that. But what I'm talking about unfilmables is going into the character's history. Joe, who used to be the city council member that had pushed through the initiative to redo the sewers in the city until all the sewers collapsed and then he got run out of office. How are you going to communicate that to the audience? If that's important to the story, then dramatize it somehow. Put it in the dialogue. Have characters whisper behind their backs about him as he walks by that, oh yeah, he was that city council member that got drummed out because the sewers collapsed. Or show it, or show newspaper clippings or something to have it, if that's important to that character, where he still has cold sweats every time he walks by a sewer because he's afraid that it's, one that he installed that, or had installed that, collapsed and it's just waiting to cave in. So you can't put a person's history down. It's one thing to say, okay, this another character is introduced and Martha, Clark's mother, okay. So you're kind of indicating, even though you've shown exactly, you're not going to see her give birth, but you can get that understanding through the relationship of how they're working, how they're interacting together. So something like that is okay, but be careful that you're not giving background story, background information that can't be used by the actor or can't be seen by the audience. Another thing is their thoughts. So Ralph is watching this NASCAR race and thinking about how great it would be if he was behind the wheel of the car. Well, again, how is the audience going to know that unless he actually turns to the person sitting next to him and says, wow, you know how great it would be to be behind the wheel of that car? Man, that would be awesome. Or have a voiceover or something. I don't know. But you can't just write things and put them on the screen that won't be seen, because it doesn't do anything other than the reader gets something out of it. Maybe the actor can work with something as far as some insight. But here again, if this guy is a NASCAR fan, have him all decked out in NASCAR gear or whatever. Show it in his, in his house that he has race car posters all over the place or something. Then we understand. Oh, this is the character. He's a NASCAR fan.
Yeah.
So be careful of those. That's one of the main mistakes I see when people write is just because you have to be efficient with writing. And that's another thing too, is be very sparse with your wording. Don't be eloquent. It's not a novel. You can use fragments, instead of full sentences sometimes. Get in and, be real terse with your writing, still paint a picture, that's the tough thing. Create this picture of what the scene is. And, so in the reader's mind, I've got that visual. Cool. But you don't have to go into every single detail, because you're writing a blueprint for the rest of the production people, your production designer, your cinematographer, your costume designer, and so on and so forth, and of course the actors, to where they can take this and then they can run with it, and it makes something kind of cool.
Absolutely. We're coming up on about 10 to 15 minutes left in the show. So I did want to say to those who are watching on Facebook Live, if you've got any questions that you have for Steve, feel free to throw them in the chat. We do have one from Donna Kirby. Do you have or recommend a particular format for your outlines that you like to use for writing your screenplays?
Outlines. Well, there's a couple different stages that you can go through with that. I mean, the simplest is just start numbering your scenes. What I generally do is break down into acts. So you have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Act 2 is generally the longest one. If you think about a 2-hour movie, think in terms of half-hour chunks. So first 30 minutes or 30 pages of a screenplay, because a properly formatted screenplay would be approximately a minute of 1 page equals a minute of screen time. So say about 30 pages is Act 1, when you establish your main characters, the setting, and the conflict. And then there's a decision that gets made, and there's something, a call to action, and the problem gets dumped in the character's lap, and now, boom, he has to go out and solve the problem. So now Act 2 is developing the problem. So outlining, figure out what your Act 1 is. That, okay, at the turning point, we have 30 pages to develop. Now, again, this is a feature screenplay. For a short, you're kind of compressing things down to where I would say just like the first minute, minute or 2 minutes, establishing what, who people are in this situation and whatnot. But in a feature, so okay, so within 30 pages, I've got to reach these milestones, if you will, and so you can work your way to it. How do you introduce a character? What's the best way to build this world around us so the audience is fully immersed into whatever your imagination has come up with? Then in Act 2, if again based on a 2-hour script where 120 pages, so from page 30 to page 60, let's develop the problem. Let's put that character on the road. Let's give them challenges that they're having to face as they're working their way up to something. Then that midpoint turning point there at page 60, well, and I'm simplifying things, but now you've got a twist and things get thrown in a different direction. And now the character, maybe, you think of Dorothy and amassing all of her friends, and now she has to go after the witch, because, where at one point they were going after the wizard, but now they have another goal to go after, and now they have to go and kill the witch. So you have that turning point, and which leads to your crisis at the end of Act 2. And so let's say on page 90, you're at the lowest point possible, and now the characters have to do, your protagonist has to make a decision that will lead to the resolution and the climax. And so when outlining, break it down into smaller chunks like that. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, the turning point in the middle of Act 2. And it doesn't have to be, precisely on those pages, but, give or take that, that's kind of the goal. And then you can start filling in the scenes to reach those major milestones in the screenplay. There's also a stage called a treatment, where you basically take the screenplay format. So you have your slug lines, your scene header, and then just fill in each scene with, exterior barn night, and then what happens there. And then the next scene is, interior living room day. And then what happens there? You don't have to go into really elaborate detail. You don't have to flesh out the dialogue. If you know that there's lines of dialogue you want to put in, sure, go ahead and throw it in. But basically, get that treatment down to where now you have it in what's looking like screenplay format, and it flows, and you can kind of read the story and see if the story works. And if you need to rearrange scenes, that's the best time to do it, because you're not locked into anything where you have all these intertwining threads that have to be um, you know resewn when you move things around. If you delete scenes, or you have to add more scenes to make the story make sense, whatever. That's the stage to do that. And once you have that solid, where you feel pretty comfortable about it, then start fleshing out the dialogue and the action. Most of the writing is done for you now. Now that's the fun part, but it's a lot of work. And
Yeah.
a lot of people don't like doing all the work that it needs to, to reach that point.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. A couple of more things I wanted to chat about before we end the show. Rewriting.
Mm-hmm.
So your script is done. You send it to your inner circle, whoever it might be.
Well, I should say the first draft is done.
Yeah, the first draft is done. Yeah. So that your first draft is done, you send it out to your inner circle. They give you feedback, and then you decide, okay, well, now I've got to start writing the second draft. What would be the advice you would give for those who are doing rewrites?
Well, what I usually do is I will print it out, and not everybody will do this, of course, but like this is a feature screenplay here, Maelstrom, which just got accepted into the press festival. But I've gone through, and you can see here, like, made little notes in red because it's easy to see. So the red line, this one, because I've gone through so many drafts, this was just try to, fix some problems that I knew I had. So I've gone through, here's another example of, sorry about that. So I've redlined, just crossed out words or made notes. And so a lot of the rewriting is done for me by hand, just, jotting down notes and saying, okay, this is an area that I need to address. I usually end up then going back into the file, and I'll go through and add my notes. Some screenwriting programs, like Movie Magic Screenwriter that I use, has a feature to where you can put notes in there that you can either print or not print, depending on your choice. But you can say, okay, this scene needs. So for those of you who may not want to waste paper and writing it out, go through and make notes in the file. And because as you're reading it, things will occur to you that, yeah, this line doesn't look right. There's the urge, if you will, to start rewriting as you're reading through, and I do that a lot. I don't know if that's necessarily the best way. I mean, some people it might work, but for me, if I make notes and then I can go back through after I've read the whole thing and just be objective myself with it, then I can go through and see what the notes were that I made and then change things as I'm writing. But as far as feedback from other people, take it seriously, but take it with a grain of salt too, to some degree, because some people, like I said, might have just they might be reading things from a different perspective than where you're coming from, but consider each of the notes that they give you and either accept it or reject it. And if you don't think that it's something that is really worth addressing, don't. It's usually you'll go through 3 or 4 drafts before it gets solid. I would say, go through and get a draft done before you try to rewrite, because that's a mistake a lot of people make, is trying.
You'll never finish if that happens.
You never finish, and I've run into that myself. So, but one advantage of printing it out is you have this document here, and you feel the weight, and now it's not bound, but if you bind it with some threads, it's kind of cool. It's like, oh wow, this is an accomplishment. Short films, a little bit easier, but be very critical, and look at unnecessary characters. Can you combine characters? Can you cut scenes? Can you cut dialogue? Can you start a scene later than what you have it in the script? Can you end it earlier than what you have it in the script? It's always rule of thumb is come into a scene late and leave early. And the pacing is the pacing. Um, so these are all things. Make a list. Dialogue. We were talking about that earlier. Read through the entire script, just reading your protagonist dialogue, and see if you can beef up that character just in that dialogue, and then go through the supporting characters, your antagonists, and take it one character at a time and see if every line of dialogue that particular character says is in character with what he or she would be saying.
No, absolutely. And last thing before we get out of here, so you've written your final draft, your script is done. What do you do next?
On to the next one. Okay. Well, here again, it gets back to what your intent is with it. If we're talking about a short film that you want to produce, then by all means, figure out what you need to do to get this produced. If that means, if you're going to direct it, terrific. Are you going to try to partner up with a producer who can break the script down and figure out a budget for you? And can you do that yourself? Or because it's going into production is its own set of headaches that I won't even get into. But as far as a feature, what is your intent with this feature? Is it something that you're going to try to raise money for and shoot yourself? In which case, is it something that realistically you can get the budget for? And again, you're going to have to bring in a producer if you don't know how to do this yourself. Write down the script, budget it out, schedule it out, figure out what all the elements are that you're going to need to do this. Because I'm in the middle of doing that right myself, trying to package a feature film and get financing for it. And it's a tough thing to do. If you're going to sell it, then you need to think about, okay, what's the best way of going about that? Getting an agent, getting a manager, trying to get sign up for IMDb Pro, and you can get a listing of a lot of different professionals in there. You start trying to contact production companies yourself and saying, in pitching it to them. If there's, because that's a whole other situation, is pitching it to companies. And right now it's kind of a weird time with the coronavirus and everything, but in general, the film industry is at a different place in 2020 than it was in 2010 and it was in 2000. Things have moved to more of a blockbuster mentality from major studios, and smaller, more personal films tend to go into streaming or cable services. And so there's a really big disparity between types of films being made. And so you have to kind of figure out, okay, who is the best person or company to make this, and so try to start reaching out to them. If your film is a festival, or your script is a festival piece, and that's really all you want to do is just get it into contests, go onto Film Freeway and start looking at what screenplay contests are out there. Blue Cat screenplay competition is kind of gold standard. There's a lot of them out there. If your film is a genre, if the story is a genre like science fiction, fantasy, or horror, or whatnot, see if there's a contest or festival that specializes in that. See if they offer feedback, and also look at the fee, because this can be really expensive. Count on minimum $35 to enter a screenplay contest. Unless you have a lot of money at hand, it's going to be expensive to get it out there and get into contests. And chances are you're not win anything, or especially if you get feedback for your money, that's always good.
Yeah, festivals, I feel like that could be its own separate podcast.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So in closing, well, first off, I want to thank you for having this really informative chat. I've been excited to do this since we booked it, I think it was like a week ago. So thank you for. I know we've been kind of talking off and on since Pensacon, so it was good to chat with you on the show.
Well, thank you for bringing me on, and bear in mind too, I'm things I've said and advice I've given, it's coming from my own perspective. Other people may have different takes on how they approach things, and we're actually. I'm going to be moderating a panel on this topic on the 23rd of the month, July 23rd, Thursday, I believe, through Emerald Coast Filmmakers, and we've got a panel of screenwriters and screenwriting teachers and script consultants and professionals who do this every day. So what I've kind of talked about is just kind of scratches the surface, and so they might have a completely different perspective on things than what I have.
That's why you'll have to tune in on July 23rd, which I believe that's going to be at 7 p.m. So just follow Emerald Coast Filmmakers on Facebook, and you'll be able to watch that. We do have one more question in closing. This is from Joseph Velez. In closing, what's your take on the trajectory of the film industry?
Well, I think once we get past this situation that we have right now with where the industry can get back to work, it's going to be a different animal. Right now, we've got theaters that are currently open, which largely drive-in theaters or little independent theaters. They're showing a lot of old movies. Empire Strikes Back was the #1 movie this past weekend.
I read that.
Jurassic
That was
Park,
great.
Yeah, and Jurassic Park was #1 a couple weeks ago. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool that these classic films that I grew up on are back in the theater for people to see again. Fortunately, not around this neck of the woods, but the thing is that theaters will be opening up again, and the studios are going to have to figure out some way of surviving, because it's, like I said, we've kind of gone for, these extremes to where it's either $250 million blockbusters or micro budget films. There's very few just middle of the ground, like Knives Out was probably most what I can come up with as far as kind of a middle of the road budgeted film, and I don't even know what the budget was for that movie. But I think we're going to see a lot more films on streaming. Right now, they're hungry for content because the industry's been shut down for 6 months, so nobody's been making anything. I think we might end up with a glut of things of shows here pretty soon.
Yeah.
But, so we'll see. It's an interesting time we're living in, if nothing else.
That's putting it mildly. I expect, I was actually having this conversation the other day. I expect that once the film industry can get back to work, I think we're going to see this huge surge in creativity, because those who write can still write at home.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just a matter of getting it made.
And I recommend, if you're working from home, you're sitting at home, if you're not working, then by all means, put your creativity to work. I was out of work for a period of time, and that's when I wrote Paradigm, and which has ended up winning a couple of awards recently and done quite well at a couple other festivals. And yeah, I mean, sit down and do it. Don't waste time. It's use time that you have right now to be productive.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So is there anything else that you want to plug before we call this a show?
Just like I said, we've got the panel on 7 o'clock on July 23rd, and we're talking more about screenwriting. And, so if you want to check out anything else about me, check out my website, stephenjwise.com, and our Facebook page, some of the same thing. So.
Fantastic. Steve, thank you again so much for coming on the show. This was awesome.
Well, thank you for having me. I always enjoy talking with you.
No, absolutely. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at D Diamond Podcast. If you want to subscribe to the show, I'm on YouTube as well as all podcasting platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all those fun places where you can get your podcast for free. And also thank you to the Unicorn Wranglers for providing the theme music for the show. You can check out their music on Apple Music, Google Play, and Spotify. That's going to do it for this week's show. Thank you once again to Steve, and we'll see you guys back here next week for another fun episode of the Derek Diamond Experience.